Hi there and welcome back to the channel. It's very nice to have you here again. For those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Matthias and I'm an underwater cinematographer and filmmaker based in Zurich, Switzerland. On this channel here at the Underwater Filmmaking School, we talk all about filming underwater and how you can get the best possible images with the equipment that you've got at hand. Now in last week's video I talked about what equipment I have been using for the past about 2 years to do my underwater filming, which is the GH5S in a Nauticam housing, and I also use a Atomos Ninja 5 monitor also in a Nauticam housing, combined with a set of underwater video lights by the company Scuba Lamp. I also talk about why I chose that specific setup for the type of filming that I do, and if you haven't seen that video, please feel free to click the link up here and it will take you straight to that video. Now today's video is kind of a continuation of last week's video where we talked about the reasons why I chose that equipment, and in today's video I actually want to show you what difference does it make in image quality, whether you're filming with a large system like the one that I'm using, or whether you're using a small action camera like, for example, the Paralens dive camera, which is specifically designed to be used underwater. Now I don't want to talk about the obvious differences in weight and size, but I want to talk about the difference in image quality that you can get or expect from using a larger system like the GH5S compared to a small and compact system like an action cam. To be able to show you this, we'll have to jump onto the computer. Alright, and here we are in Final Cut Pro 10, my preferred editing software that I've been using for quite a while now. And what I want to do with you guys is show you a few different shots and talk about the difference in quality between a shot taken with the GH5S in the Nauticam housing to a similar shot taken with the Paralens Dive Camera Plus. Now I've got 3 different types of shots that I want to go through with you. This first one here is a school of Anthias, small reef fish on a coral reef. This is the shot of the Panasonic GH5, and we have a similar shot here taken with the Paralens Dive Camera Plus. These are raw footages as taken directly from the camera. You can see that the footage of the GH5 is quite flat, and this is because I normally film in a very flat profile. It's not log, it's a custom-made profile where I take saturation and contrast all the way down to -5, and that just gives me more leeway for editing in post. Now the GH5 shots, they've all been taken in 4K, 24p and in 10-bit 422. The Paralens shots on the other side, they have been taken in 2K, 60p and 8-bit 420, and we're working here on a full HD 24p timeline. So all the shots are going to be downscaled to HD and 24p. So we've got those Anthias as a first comparison shot. We'll get into editing in a minute, and then we've got also a shot of a Nemo, an anemone fish in its anemone. This one is the GH5 one, this one is the Paralens one, and then to close it off we've got a shot with high contrast. This is a shot in a sort of a cavern system. This one is the one taken with the GH5, and this one is in the same cavern system taken with the Paralens. Now the interesting thing with this shot here, the cavern shot, is that obviously with the cinema system, the GH5S, I can control the exposure manually to 100% and therefore make sure that the shot stays fairly dark, and then in post-production I can just lighten up parts of the shot that I want to have lit up. On the other hand, on the parallels shot here, because I don't really have much control over the exposure there, the camera itself decides how much it wants to crank up the ISO, which it does quite a lot here, to make the shot pleasing for what the camera thinks is pleasing. But at the same time, you can see that here the light rays coming in through the holes in the reef at the top, they actually create a lot of clipped highlights here in this part here, and that's going to be a little challenging to edit that later on, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, let's have a look at the very first shot, and here I'll actually go through my editing process, my color correction process with you guys, so you can see what I'm doing. Alright, now let's start with this first shot of the Matthias, here the GH5 shot. Now, whenever I edit or color grade footage, underwater footage, I always want to have my scopes open. I have my Luma waveform, I have my vector scope, and I also have my RGB parade, which help me get the color right and just balance the picture to the best possible way. Now, as you can see, this is a very flat picture simply because I've used a custom setting on the GH5. And you can see that the whole exposure is fairly compressed, and we can now just make it a little wider again, make it a little more pleasing. What I always like to do in Final Cut Pro 10 is to see if the auto correction does any good to the picture. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, especially with underwater footage. It is sometimes a little tricky, and depending on the framing, really, depending on what you've got in your shot, it might work or not. So we'll select this first clip and we'll click the auto color correction, and we'll see what happens. It takes a moment, and it has put a little bit more saturation in there. It has just widened the exposure a little bit. It's actually not too bad if we compare it to what we had before. It's actually done a fairly good job. Still not quite enough for me, so we'll go into the color correction tab and we'll start correcting or fine-tuning the color correction. This first step, you don't really have to do it with the auto color correction. You can basically start from scratch if you want to, but sometimes this can give you a good starting point at the beginning of your color correction process. So looking at the Luma waveform first and the exposure, the general exposure of our image, we want to try to keep the highest, the brightest point of the image just below 100, and we want to keep the darkest spot of the image just above 0. So coming over here, we use the highlight wheel and the exposure section on the right, and we'll just pull that up a little bit. As we do so, you can see how the exposure changes just about there, and we'll do the same thing with the shadows. We'll bring them down a little bit. That's a bit too much, just like this. That'll do. All right, and now with the midtones, we can see what we want to do with the midtones. We can play around with it a little bit. We can pull them up a little bit, see how that inflicts on the picture, or we can just pull them down. And I personally think it looks nicer if it got a little more contrast in there, so it's a little darker, so I'll keep them just below here. Now, the next thing that we want to do is increase our saturation, because I have been shooting in a flat and a desaturated profile. There's not a lot of saturation in here. You could basically just use your master wheel and just increase or decrease the entire saturation of your image. Sometimes that works quite well. Well, it's not too bad. Bringing that back, we can also just use the individual wheels and increase or decrease saturation there. Now I want to have the highlights a little bit more saturated. I want to have the midtones just a tiny bit, and also just a tiny bit on the shadows. So that's actually quite pleasing to me. That looks fine. Now, if we want to compare this to what we had before, we'll deselect all the effects, and you can see how the image changes quite a bit. And I'm actually quite pleased with how it looks now that we've applied our color correction. There's a lot more detail in there. There is a lot more contrast, maybe not detail, but contrast in there. There is also a lot more color in there. Yeah, it just looks a lot more pleasing than what it was before. And we've also got a more bluish color in the background. To me, this could be a little more intense, the bluish background, just to make the foreground pop a little more. So what we can do here is go back to the color correction wheel. We'll select not the color wheels, but we'll go to the color curves. And here the second one, the saturation, we'll select the selection tool and select just any of the areas that have the color that we want to increase saturation on, which is the blue here. We've selected that, and now we can increase saturation on the blue background, and you can see how we can make this just instantly look more bluish and a bit clearer in my opinion. So if we deselect this, you see how it's more subtle, more soft blue color. Having that activated, it is a more intense and more saturated blue color. So going back to the beginning and checking the entire changes, all the changes, deselecting the effects, this is what we started off with, and selecting them again, we'll see the picture as it is right now, and I personally do like that quite a bit. So we'll leave it to this. Okay, now let's head over to the comparison clip, the one that has been taken with the Paralens Dive Camera Plus, which is this one here. We'll select the clip, and as you can see here with the camera, it doesn't record in a flat profile. We've got a lot more contrast, a lot more saturation to the image, which we'll have to adjust for a little bit here with the color correction. First again, we'll try the automatic color correction, see what that does to the shot. And there is a slight change, nothing dramatic, but there is a slight change. If we look at what it looked before, what it looks now, it's just a little bit of a change, not much though. Okay, so we'll have to go into our color correction section, and while we get there, if we look at the Luma waveform here, we can see that the image is overexposed right here where the sun is coming in, and down at the bottom the shadows are pretty okay, but the highlights are too bright or too high. So we'll pull down on the highlights a little bit so they get below the 100 mark. That's much better, and it's still a little contrasty for my taste. So what I would like to do is bring up the shadows just a little bit so we get rid of some of that contrast. And now we can also increase the midtones, just bring the midtones up a tiny bit. That's not too bad. Now if we compare it to what we had before, I do actually like this better. Yeah. And now we're gonna bring some saturation back into the image, and again we can do that either by using the master wheel, or we can just use the individual ones. I'm gonna put a little more saturation here in the highlights. I like to saturate them a little more, not too much on the midtones, and just a little bit on the shadows. And now it's actually quite a bit saturated. What I like to do now, specifically on the Paralens footage, is to bring down the general saturation by just a little bit, just like this, and I find this to be a more pleasing image that way. Looking at what we had before, this is what we have now. Before and now. So the next thing that we want to do is we also want to try to make this background here, the bluish background, a little more bluish and a little more saturated. Again, we'll go into the color curves. And now, because here the color hasn't really been captured as it is, it's more sort of a greenish color and less the bluish that we've got here on our GH5 shot. So what we want to do on the parallel shot is first of all use the selection tool and select this area here, and then pull down on the middle point to make it go a little more towards the bluish. So shift the whole color a little more towards bluish. And as you can see, it's only going to shift this specific color, so it's not going to affect the rest of your image. That's the really cool part about this method of color correcting your image. Now, if we deselect, you can see that it actually does make a difference. So the further side is getting bluish, more bluish now, and now we can also saturate this section a little more by again selecting, using the selection tool of the saturation curve and making this a little more saturated. Maybe this is a little extreme. If we take this off again, this is what it looked like, this is what it looks now. I don't really like this kind of mixture between the green kind of spill coming off the reef here and the bluish part of the deep blue section here, but it's basically as good as it gets with a quick color correction as we do here. Now let's look at the end result. Let's look at what we've started off with. We had this to start off with and we ended up with this. It's not a huge dramatic change, but it does make the picture a little more pleasing. There's a little more, it just looks nicer in my opinion. But it's never as big of a change as we have here on our GH5 clip. If we have a look at this again, this is what we started off with. And this is the image that we've got after applying the color correction. So here, for comparison reason, you can see those two shots side by side. On the left you'll see the GH5 image, on the right you'll see the Paralens Dive Camera Plus image. First, as they have been taken off the camera, no color correction applied there, and then in a second step here you can see now what they look like with the color correction applied. Let's get to the second shot. That's the shot of our Nemo here, and I'm not going to go through the entire process of color correcting it again. I've already done that, but it's deselected for this shot. So this is what the shot looks like straight off the camera with the color correction. This is what it looks like after applying the color correction, same as we've done on the first shot. So you can see there is a nice correction and a nice difference between the unedited and the corrected shot. Going to the parallel shot. This is the parallel shot. And this is the unedited shot straight off the camera. And again here, if we do the color correction, this actually turns out quite nice. Looking at the difference, we can actually make this shot look quite nice. And same here as well, I'll show you those two shots side by side. First with the raw footage, no color correction applied, and second with the color correction applied to each of the clips, so you can see the difference. Last but not least, let's get to our cavern shots here. So we've got the GH5 shot here, and again this is not corrected, this is straight off the camera. And if we apply the corrections that I've made before, you will see how the shot changes in a second. My computer is just very slow right now. Here we go. So you can see that in with this shot, I can actually lighten up certain parts of the image, just bring up the shadows and make it look much nicer that way. Also, you will see that none of the bright parts, the light actually coming in from the top, none of these bright parts is overexposed, and that's the beauty when you shoot in a flat profile with a larger style camera, that you can actually control that exposure a lot better, and you can also, make this background here look a lot more bluish than what it was originally. Here it looks more greenish on the screen, but we can make that look a lot more bluish and lighten up some other parts of the image there as well. Going to the paralens shot here, and this is what I mentioned before, because on the paralens I don't have any way of controlling the exposure the camera chooses. It will just crank up ISO in a darker environment like a cavern like we've got here, and therefore you've got a little bit of noise in the shadows here around the corners, but also the problem here being that all the bright parts, they're not overexposed. You can see that quite clearly here on the wave, on the Luma waveform. And if I do my color correction, I can make the shot a little more pleasing, for sure. Looking at that change, yes, it looks a little better, but because those highlights, they were clipping, there was no more information in those highlights as we were recording them, I can bring them down as far as I like. So I'm just giving you a bit of an example here. Just go to the color wheels. I can bring them down as far as I like. They're still going to be overexposed simply because there is no color information left in those areas. So again, here I'll give you the comparison side by side. On the left again, the GH5 shot in the caverns, unedited, and the unedited paralens shot on the right, and the GH5 shot edited and color corrected specifically on the left, and on the right the paralens shot color corrected as well. So wrapping up this little excursion into the field of color correction, I think it was very well visible how much more leeway you have when it comes to color correcting with a system like the GH5S. Now this doesn't mean that you can't get nice underwater shots using a compact camera system like the Paralens Dive Camera Plus. As you have seen on some of these shots here, it is possible to get some nice shots, but you are limited in the way you can manipulate and you can color correct those shots in post. So you do need to make sure that you do get most of it correct in camera, which again is not always possible simply because you cannot manipulate or you cannot control all the different settings like exposure, for example, on a small compact camera. And on a larger camera, like for example the GH5S, you can control everything manually on the dive, and therefore just have the best possible starting point for your color correction when you bring the footage into your editing software and start color correcting it. And that's it for today's video. Thank you very much for your time and for watching. I hope I was able to give you some information and show to you what difference does it make whether you are filming with a larger scale camera like the GH5S underwater or with a small and compact action cam system. Now, if this video was useful to you in any way, please hit that like button. You know it means a lot to me, and also consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on any videos that will be uploaded here in the future. Also, I've put some links down in the video description to the equipment that I'm using underwater. So if you do want to go and check out any of the equipment that I'm currently using, feel free to go and check them out through those links. And as always, if you do have any questions regarding today's video, if you have any questions regarding which video system is best for your needs, please feel free to put them down in the comment section, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week.